Hey everybody, welcome again to CommonSenseHD.com, the TV show, and don't forget CommonSenseHD.com, the website, approaching 26,000 guests, and actually going at a pace of about 1,000 visits a week, so I'm really excited about that. And don't forget the YouTube, and I want to remind you all that this is the 57th show, and today's guest is a very special guest to me. Today's guest is the business manager of the International Brotherhood of Electrical and Electronic Workers, 222, Myles Calvey. Thank you very much, Myles. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about what is the International Brotherhood of Electrical and Electronic Workers?
The IBEW is the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and we represent mainly the electrical industry, but government workers, railroad workers, telephone workers, who I represent within Verizon, within AT&T, within contract companies. We represent Comcast workers. We represent pretty much anyone who touches or supports a wire.
Okay. So where are you guys located physically?
Our local is in Dorchester on Washington Street, 1137, right in Lower Mills of Dorchester.
Mm-hmm. And how many members are there?
In 2222, there's 2,200 members.
Okay. And how many members are there in the international? Because I know that as part of the evolution of the union, it went from the National Brotherhood of Electrical Workers to the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers when Canada began to participate as well.
There's about 685,000, and it's international because it represents Canadian electrical workers and telephone workers, and also Puerto Rico, Guam, and because of the groups outside of the United States, so we're considered international.
And so what are some of the fields that are represented within your participation of, you've mentioned telecommunications. In watching and researching some of the material that I saw, you're very diverse. I mean, you actually have a school. That was one of the things that was most interesting to me, where the workers are actually trained.
Within Verizon does the training to make a telephone work on Verizon products, but within the building trades here in the Burlington area, they're represented by IBEW Local 103. Local 103, they train their electricians. So their union electrician would come in from scratch and get 4 years of electrical training, and at the end of that, beginning as apprentice, they'd be a full-blown journeyman electrician. And if they chose to be a telecommunications technician, they would go in and from scratch become a full, diverse telecommunications technician.
And so what are some of the field areas that people work in for IBEW? Because I know there were some really interesting ones, and ones that people wouldn't think that people actually worked in. And I know you have a lot of very positive sponsors who believe in the sort of the training and the quality that is an outcome of that training through the oversight of the union.
With the exception of the electrical and telecom, which we talked about, we also have the railroad industry, government employees, media employees, and again, an evolution of somebody who first starts out associated with an electrical group, and then you get your own primary group. Manufacturing, one of the largest manufacturers here in Massachusetts, Raytheon, is represented by the IBEW. So what the international unions try to do is stay focused on a particular field. Like the IBEW would not represent cement workers. They wouldn't represent plumbers. They represent specifically electrical, and try to stay focused on that specialty so that you can get the best quality representation by the leadership, and you stay focused on one group so that you can deal with all the issues that are associated with a particular group.
So how did the union get started? That's a really interesting story.
Well, the basic answer is no more than what we go to work for, and that's simply wages. In the very, very late 1800s, early 1900s, workers basically had no rules. If a company made $1, workers were probably getting 2 or 3 cents of that. Yet they were forced to work many hours. There was no 40-hour work week. There were no 5-day work weeks. There were long hours, low pay, terrible working conditions. They were unsafe. They were unhealthy. They were easily fired. And quite frankly, it was a revolution, per se, of workers saying we've had enough. And some very, very courageous men and women who put themselves on the line, who were willing to say, I'm willing to give up not only my job, but where I live. In the early days, in order for a company to capture you, they'd put you in their housing. You would be 100% subservient to that employer. In the telephone industry, which began here right in Boston, Mass, Alexander Graham Bell, we had one of the first formations of a union back in the early 1900s, and it started out with telephone operators. And we had a great, great leader of women back in the early 1900s, Julia O'Connor, and she was famous for her hardcore stance on getting women's rights in the 1900s, when she was upset because the telephone company was charging her operators too much money for the linen that they had to buy off the company to put on the beds that the company supplied at, in those days, Bloomfield Street in Boston, where it's unheard of for somebody to think about some of the conditions that went on in those days. But if you were going to be an operator in the phone company, the first thing that you had to pledge for, and you're quite frankly held to almost as a subpoena, you could not be a married woman. You think that one over. You could not work for the phone company if you're going to be a married woman. The second one, you had to commit to working not only for the company unlimited number of hours, but also you had to live in the company facility, which part of your pay went to pay for those things. And the great early labor leader, Julia O'Connor, took a major corporation on at that time and said, we are not going to have these women treated that way. And she was beleaguered, fired, had the courage to not be thrown out of the place where she not only worked, but the place that she lived. She was willing to live on the street to get women's rights. And she was one of the very first real labor pioneers. We had great leaders that came out of the mining industry. We had the great Samuel Gompers, who not only made working conditions what they are in this country, but also took on social issues. And he wasn't afraid to walk on Congress and take on the political society that, quite frankly, was major corporate supporters. And they took a great big risk to get to where we are today, which is today the 40-hour work week, the weekends, the time and a half for overtime. This was unheard of. Time and a half, it was almost treason to think that you could go to a company and say that you're making too much money. And it's no coincidence that at the formation of the early unions is where the barons of the country were at their peak. The Mellons, the Andrew Carnegies, the Rockefellers, they could not have enough money while people were, quite frankly, doing anything to get to work. It was also at the height of immigration, where workers could be taken advantage of, and it took a small group of leaders to take that band of new Americans and form which what the unions are today. And there's a real parallel going back to the early 1900s to what we are doing today with the de-escalation of unions and corporate America, forcing Congress to do so many anti-union legislation. We are now getting back to more part-time jobs in this country, less good-paying jobs in this country. And if in this century, in the last century, the organized labor is synonymous with anything, it's middle-class jobs. There was a time going back with the evolution of unions that when unions started, we went into World War I. We came out of World War I with not a lot of time to even catch your breath, and we immediately went back into World War II. But while those wars were being fought, and in between those wars, we still had these courageous men and women putting together coalitions, putting together groups, in making working conditions, so that we peaked with organized labor in the 1950s, which about 1954, 1955, 6 and 7 years after World War II, where it was pretty much committed that if you were going to work, you were going to work in a union job. And with the lack of unions, and with really the pushback started with corporate America through our political system, Americans now are suffering because of this. And you look at the early struggles of the labor leaders in the early 1900s. They pushed for not only working conditions, good pay, but they pushed for education, they pushed for housing, and they pushed for food. Food, shelter, and clothing was the epitome of what labor was looking for. And if those early labor leaders came back today, they'd just be shaking his head. As we look at what the decline of unions, we're now into a situation here in 2013 where what they had fought so hard to get with a peak of 1955, it's slowly disappearing as more and more minority corporate leaders take more and more control of this country and have, quite frankly, made selfishness the epitome of the downfall of workers.
Well, that's one of the sort of the things I noticed in reviewing the material that was available on the internet, and that they sort of were paralleling growth in some corporations to the union-busting companies of the Carnegie Mellons in the 20s and 30s, and that we're revisiting that whole process. But not only are they just taking out workers, they're taking out whole communities in a sense. And so that we've seen some of that sort of protest of communities against some of these corporations, and in support of individual workers for the development of workers' coalitions and workers' rights. So what were some of I know in reviewing some of the material I saw, one of the things, or where the IBEW got its start was in the telegraph industry?
Well, it began right with electricity, but with the lack of communications back in the early 1900s, the telegram was the major form of telecommunications or communications. You think about it now with the internet, where you can go to your computer and talk to anybody in the world. Think about sitting at a table and hitting this little thing that wasn't even a typewriter by making certain dots. That's how they communicated. But the greatest invention was the light bulb. With the light bulb came electricity. And to get any type of national group began with lights. With lights, after that was communication. And the IBEW took part in both of those. The early beginnings of the IBEW was putting power lines up and getting power into cities and towns. It was extremely dangerous. Many, many workers were killed climbing poles with all kinds of voltage up on those poles to get service into different parts of the country. And there was many electrocutions, which eventually came around to getting more workers combined into a collective bargaining group to ask for